Video game strategy guides. These sacred texts used by our ancestors were very common and sometimes even essential in the early generations of video games. These printed books served as not only a guide, but a beacon of hope during these primitive times. However, these books would see a drastic decline as technology advanced and the internet began to thrive. How did strategy guides go from being a common add-on purchase to basically becoming extinct? Let's get into it. Being a gamer in the early generation of video games was tough. Now, I wasn't a game journalist, but I was a kid. A lot of games were pretty straightforward to follow, like Mario or Pokémon. But how was I supposed to beat games like Resident Evil or Metal Gear Solid? It was pretty easy for me to get stuck in sections like the Psycho Mantis fight, or get completely lost in the backtracking and puzzles of the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil. Not to mention all of the other RPGs and games that were coming out at the time. What was a kid to do? You can ask your friend for help, hoping they had played the same game, or you were kinda screwed. However, there was a third option. If a game was pretty popular, chances are you could find a strategy guide for it. Video game strategy guides and walkthroughs were physical books that contained steps and strategies on how to beat the game, as well as other tips and tricks. They would include information like story progression, how to defeat enemies and bosses, item collection, sometimes even information that you couldn't get while playing the game. Walkthroughs would sometimes contain extra content like additional lore for the game, concept artwork, index of items. Usually these would run from about $10 to $20 depending on the game and the amount of content it had. There were even limited edition guides that were hardcover or came with additional bonus materials like separate art books or posters. Now during this time there were also a lot of gaming magazines that give gaming advice like Nintendo Power, Electronic Gaming Monthly, or PlayStation Magazine, to name a few. These magazines would provide tips for beginners and sometimes high-level guides or advice for specific games that would guide you through some of the early gaming's less hand-holding moments in the early "where the hell do I go" game design. However, most of these gaming magazines were dedicated to gaming news, like reviewing games or discussing the latest information on what was coming out at the time. The downside to these magazines was that, assuming you were subscribed, if you were stuck on a particular game, chances are that magazine may not have even covered the game you were playing. Not to mention, these came in via mail once every month, so you would have to wait for the chance your game was even included in that issue. There were also these funny little cheat guides that usually covered games on a certain console that would also provide tips or cheats for popular games out at the time. It wouldn't be uncommon for some of these to have multiple volumes as games continued to release over the console's lifetime. Neither these books nor the magazines went into the full depth of detail and information that a dedicated strategy guide would go through. And that was kind of the benefit to owning a strategy guide. You knew that what you were buying would give you the information of the game you needed help with. Towards the late 90s, the video game industry was booming, and so was the demand for strategy guides. If a new game was dropping, you would usually see a stack of guides for that game on the counter on release day. Now, a lot of companies were making game guides, but at least here in the United States, there were two main players, Brady Games and Prima Games. Brady Games was a US publishing company operated under British multinational publishing company Dorling Kindersley Limited, also known as DK. Printing their first strategy guide in 1993, Brady Games would eventually grow to publish about 100 strategy guides per year. Prima Games was also an American publishing company operating as an imprint of DK Publishing and began publishing game guides in 1990. Prima definitely seemed to have made a bigger impact on the market by landing deals with Nintendo in 2007 for certain official strategy guides, and even began selling strategy guides on Steam in 2010. In 2013, Brady Games' parent company, Penguin Group, merged with Prima's parent company, Random House, to form a new company, Penguin Random House. Very innovative, I know. By mid-2015, it was announced that both Prima and Brady Games would merge and all future prints would be published and named under Prima Games. I personally have guides from both of these companies and never noticed much of a difference between them. Outside of the label, I don't think most people would either. Both companies did a great job of creating high-quality guides and including tons of information in them. There was never really a favoritism towards one or the other like the console wars at the time. Whatever was on the shelf is what you purchased. Things definitely got more complicated for these companies once the internet began to take off.
Allison, can you explain what internet is?
No, she can't say anything in 10 seconds or less.
Physical game guides took a big hit now that people had the ability to search for help online. Before the days of YouTube, forums were on the rise and people could now discuss whatever topics they wanted. Sites like IGN or GameFAQs would host these forums for games, and individuals would gather to talk about games and provide tips or other assistance. Some would spend months or even years creating guides for specific games. These guides didn't just contain information on how to beat the game, Some would go as far as to show you diagrams, maps, even title artwork, all created painstakingly in ASCII. It's incredible to see the level of dedication and commitment some of these fans showed in their guides to go above and beyond to make something that wasn't a simple MS Notepad file with no margins. I visited the GameFAQs site often from the family computer for a lot of my games growing up. I even remember getting in trouble because I printed out a Metal Gear Solid guide one time. Sure, it was over 100 pages, but look at that artwork, how could you blame me? A lot of these guides are still up, so I recommend checking them out. It's like opening up an old time capsule. Hey, this guide even has GameShark codes. If you remember GameShark, make sure to ask for your senior citizens discount the next time you order your Grand Slam at Denny's. Now the final nail in the coffin was YouTube. The introduction of the video sharing site now allows gamers to find hundreds of thousands of videos on games. Channels and content creators are dropping gaming news, let's plays, speedruns, walkthroughs, even live streams. You don't even need to search in a huge text document for where you're at in the game. You can just type in keywords in the search bar for what you're looking for and you'll get 30 videos on it. You can even find videos on games nobody's playing anymore. Gaming channels are even dropping tips and information before a game even releases. According to the official YouTube blog, in 2020 over 100 billion hours of gaming content was watched with over 40 million gaming channels. Add in over 10 billion hours of watched live streams and it's no question YouTube has become the ultimate platform for gaming information, and it's only going to grow. Even now with smartphones you don't even need a computer. Access to all the information you need is within your pocket. With the internet and YouTube taking over the market, there just isn't a need for the physical medium anymore. The only physical guides I see in store nowadays are these weird online multiplayer tip guides for games like Fortnite and Apex. Even Prima Games announced in 2019 that they would stop making physical books and would focus solely on online guides and gaming news. This makes sense as the industry has been shifting to games that now include extra content DLC, or games that are live services with the new content being constantly added. This makes it harder for companies to create physical guides that would contain all of the information on a game. As a consumer, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Online guides allow you to not only save money, but you don't have to worry about finding space to store them. There are still some companies like Future Press and Piggyback that release strategy guides. These guides are still high quality and contain all of the same content you would find in typical strategy guides. However, they only tend to do prints for big AAA titles with only 1 to 2 releases a year at this point. Even though they've become nearly non-existent, I still consider strategy guides an integral part of gaming history. I'll still check out discount bookstores or online from time to time for some guides of my favorite games growing up, even though I get all of my current gaming questions and trophy information from sites like PowerPix and YouTube. Strategy guides have become more of a collector's item with some of the older or rare editions easily going over $100. So why buy one? I already know how to beat the game, I've done it hundreds of times. Like any other collector's item for a game, I like having another piece of my favorite game or franchise in my collection. It's nice to flip one of these open and see the detail and information some of these companies put into their guides. Or maybe it's just the nostalgia of remembering the good old days of playing these games growing up. It's hard to imagine anything we use today in video games to follow the same route that strategy guides did, but we can only hope.